Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history. This podcast is designed for you to learn things about London that most Londoners don't even know, all in 20 minutes. I'm your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Show notes plus photos or recommended reading transcripts can be found on each associated episode's webpage. Simply go to londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast. Don't forget, if you enjoy what we do, then please rate and review. It warms the cockles of my heart to read your appreciation of this labour of love. Get that cup of tea, put your feet up, and enjoy. London's Underground Railway is not only the oldest system of its kind, it's also the world's most famous. The Tube, as it's also known, is more than just a way of getting around the capital. It's also a symbol of the city. More than 4 million people use it every day. On Tuesday this week, more than 130,000 passengers piled aboard the first trains running on the new 18.9 billion Elizabeth line within hours of its launch. Transport enthusiasts gathered at Paddington Station and Abbey Wood in southeast London to be on the first morning services. The Elizabeth line is believed to help transform life and travel in London and the southeast, and will increase central London's rail capacity by 10%. With history being made this week, I thought it'd be the perfect time to look at London's very first underground line, and that means going back to Victorian London. Lord Palmerston is Prime Minister, and Charles Dickens is still alive. Victorian London's roads were heavily congested. The railways stopped on the fringes of the West End, Euston, King's Cross and Paddington. What was needed was a solution, and that solution was the Tube. The world's first underground passenger railway line, running from Bishop's Road, later to become known as Paddington, and Farringdon Street, later to become known as Farringdon in the city, opened in 1863. Charles Pearson is credited with proposing the first serious scheme for London's first underground. He was a lawyer who campaigned against the death penalty and for suffrage campaign. Pearson worked as a solicitor for the Corporation of the City of London and was an MP for Lambeth. He saw hordes of rail passengers arriving and the congestion of horse-drawn carriages and campaigned for an underground transport solution. Over the next decade, many rival schemes were proposed. Most people, and here I mean men, agreed that London needed some sort of subterranean railway to relieve the traffic. How best to do it, however, was the challenge. Pearson remained at the forefront of the campaign, and it was his influence which was instrumental in gaining planning permission. And Parliament approved the idea in 1853. Sir John Fowler was chief engineer. London roads were opened, the river fleet diverted and controlled, tenements flattened and water and gas pipes dodged. Teams of navvies worked tirelessly 24 hours a day using a cut and cover method. And cut and cover is very clever. The track was pretty shallow by today's standards, but a trench was dug from above rather than tunnelling like we'd expect now. And then brick walls were built inside, and then the roof was made from iron girders and then brick arches. And then the smoke and steam ventilation systems were installed, and you can still see some of those on the line now. And then the trench was backfilled and compacted. It also tried to follow the paths of the roads above to minimise disruption. Problems with regards to the route and raising capital for this world-first project caused delays. The first mention we can see of any work being done is mentioning on the southeastern corner of Euston Square on what was then called Seymour Street, and it's now called Eversholt Street. The Metropolitan Railway route to Farringdon Street was laid as a mixed gauge, so broad gauge and standard gauge, and it was a spin-off from the Great Western, which it contracted to operate its services. The first trains were of broad gauge type, but the Metropolitan Railway's management soon fell out with the senior company and moved over to standard gauge using borrowed stock. The broad gauge rails were then removed in 1869. London's first underground railway started from Paddington to Farringdon, but that's not what they were called back then. Paddington Station building was located on the road bridge carrying Bishop's Road, which is now Bishop's Bridge Road, over the mainline tracks of the Great Western Railway. The original Farringdon Street station was only a temporary station, and in 1865 it moved to the building it occupies today. The world first wasn't without its setbacks, including fatal injuries, sewage flooding, wall collapses, and buildings being damaged. The media dubbed the project the Drain, but good engineering prevailed. A flood happened in early 1862 when the sewer burst and leaked effluent at a rate of several gallons a minute. Another sewage-related disaster happened in June when a section of sewer fell in, causing a tide of sewage to sweep through the ground on the west side of Farringdon Road. This led to the vault holding the bodies cleared from Ray Street burial ground to break open. Lovely. Numerous workers lost their lives during the construction of the underground. It was dirty, physical work. In May 1862, before the line had opened, James Driscoll was working on an iron girder spanning the line near King's Cross. He became embroiled in an argument with a fellow worker, 34-year-old Edward Gregory. The two men exchanged blows before Gregory took hold of Driscoll and flung him with great violence into the cutting below, a distance of 50 feet. Driscoll was taken to the Royal Free Hospital, suffering compounded fractures to both legs and also several wounds on his upper body, but he later died of shock following amputation. A trial ensued and Gregory was found guilty of manslaughter, and thereby becoming the first person to be convicted of taking another life on London's underground network. January the 9th, 1863 was the date of the VIP pre-party. This was the night before the line opened to the public, and some 600 guests were carried in two trains from Paddington to Farringdon Street, passing through glorious new stations. 79-year-old Prime Minister Palmerston declined, saying he preferred to stay above ground as long as he could. The celebratory banquet was held at Farringdon, and it was to show off the new track to celebrities and politicians of the day. Charles Pearson was toasted. He had died before seeing his grand plan for London's first underground railway come to life. The public took to their first underground railway with an enthusiasm that overwhelmed the line. An estimated 38,000 people travelled on the line that day. By 11 a.m, the tube platforms were so crowded that no one was allowed on, and ticket inspectors stopped taking payments from passengers travelling between King's Cross and Farringdon Street. One newspaper on the day reported, "At this point during the morning, the crowds were immense, and the constant cry as the train arrived of 'No room' appeared to have a very depressing effect upon those assembled." The immense public interest was unsurprising, as the building project had captured the imagination of the whole city. A 13-year-old boy writing about his first trip on the tube in 1863 said, "It was still a public wonder. It had been projected and talked about for many years, and during construction had well kept in popular view, especially when the demon of the Fleet Ditch had broken into and flooded the half-finished tunnels on more than one vexatious occasion." And you know what those two occasions are. By the end of January 1863, there were 225,000 passengers a week. Staff had to be doubled, the timetable speeded up, and London's commuters never looked back. Two other familiar tube problems manifested themselves early on. At the end of January in 1863, a John Rice from Euston Road became the first man to be charged with theft on the new railway. He had been accused of being a footpad, picking the pocket of a young woman, and a footpad was basically the lowest form of a pedestrian crime, but this time it had gone subterranean. It didn't take long for the letters of complaint to come in. Irving Courtney was unhappy about an obvious defect in the new system, namely, the very short time allowed at the stations of the ingress and egress of passengers from the trains. Some things never change. If you're wanting to see some of the old Metropolitan Railway, then certainly go to Farringdon Station and the old section on Cowcross Street. That is the first permanent train station. And also there is a plaque outside Baker Street Station, which you can even see from the main road, and it says, "Beneath this roadway runs the world's first underground passenger railway. It was opened for public traffic by the Metropolitan Railway Company on 10th of January 1863. Erected by London Transport in 1963. A second underground line, the District, began operating 5 years after the opening of the first. The original plan was for the two companies to cooperate, but they fell out and didn't complete the inner circle linking all the main line termini until 1884. In 1868, the line extended from Baker Street to Swiss Cottage, and then in 1892, the line extended even further to Aylesbury. The Uxbridge branch opened in 1904. The early Underground was a huge engineering achievement and very well used, but had one big disadvantage. Its steam locomotives created a permanent fog in the stations and the tunnels. What was the experience like for customers? Well, that depended on the class of customer you were and also when you travelled. If you were a working class man, then your working day started before 9 a.m. and the first train at Paddington, Bishop's Road, would leave at 8:05. In 1864, the Metropolitan Railway began running 2 early morning trains before 6 a.m. at a return fare of threepenny-piece, and later reduced to twopence, which roughly speaking was a farthing a mile, so it was a bargain. Other railway companies followed suit, some voluntarily, some stipulated by Acts of Parliament. By 1914, 1,966 designated early trains were in service each weekday across the London network. In effect, it was a new fourth class. And timetables were published in newspapers, including the Clerkenwell News, and I'll add a link to that. The Metropolitan Railway operated almost entirely in tunnels, so the pressing issue of lighting was a concern from the oft. Gas lamps were fitted into the carriages, with 2 in each of the first-class carriages. The Daily Telegraph remarked that the lamps in the first-class compartments burned so brightly that newspapers might be read with ease. An impressive feat indeed, given that Victorian newspapers used considerably smaller print than nowadays, which also had the tendency to smudge. At first, the Metropolitan Railway used coal gas. Along the roofs of the carriages were rubber bags contained in an iron-topped wooden box, and the rubber compartment was kept under constant pressure from the weight of the iron trellis work on the top section, which created, in effect, a squeeze box. And then, in 1876, this coal gas method was eventually replaced by oil gas lighting, developed by Julius Pintz in Prussia. The compressed oil gas was stored in a large steel container and kept in the guard's van in each train. and from there pipes ran beneath the floor of individual carriages. And it was this system which became the standard system to be used not just on London's Underground, but also across Britain's railways. The gas could be distilled from oil shale or imported crude oil. The Great Eastern built an oil distillery works at Stratford, now replaced by the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. Not only were the works distilling oil there, where immense workshops were also erected for the repair and construction of other carriages and locomotives, and there is a plaque to Stratford Works there now. For those of you who have seen an old movie featuring the romantic steam trains will no doubt be familiar with how doors were opened. Railway doors were opened and closed by handles on the outside of the carriage, which meant come rain or shine, the window needed to be lowered in order to reach it. It also presented a problem. The doors were too easy to open while the train was still in motion. In the mid-1860s, the Metropolitan Railway introduced a design of door which had rounded upper corners in an attempt to keep them clear from the incurving tunnel wall should the door be opened whilst the train is in motion. The scene of time-poor London commuters springing from the open door before the decelerating train had stopped at the station was commonplace until about 1930s, and that's when air-compressed, so pneumatic sliding doors, became the norm for opening central London carriage doors. Gone are the days where one could do something similar on a Routemaster bus. The railways also needed to look at additional income streams, so money wasn't solely made by ticket sales. The Metropolitan Railway pushed out to Harrow-on-the-Hill and rural Buckinghamshire. It secured development clauses of freehold land along the route. After 1919, the owner-occupiers provided the line with continuing reward in the form of new traffic. And refreshments were a big deal too. Felix William Spiers and Christopher Pond were two Londoners who had joined forces in Australia, where they had leased a hotel grill room in Melbourne. After running two of Melbourne's theatre cafes and arranging the first All-England cricket tour to the Southern Hemisphere in 1861 from Liverpool on Brunel's SS Great Britain, they headed home to London. They took the contract to operate the Metropolitan Railway's refreshment rooms at Farringdon Station. The longest journey times on the Metropolitan Railway were 18 minutes. Their success would depend on attracting non-rail travelling Londoners. And so Spiers and Pond produced their own biscuits, cakes and ices, focusing on quality and price. The journalist and social critic John Mayhew seemed to be a fan. In 1865, he observed that the produce was better and cheaper than other railway refreshment bars, and counted up to 400 people dining at Farringdon Street Refreshment Bar in a single day. By that time, Spiers and Pond had also taken on the refreshment bar at Victorian Station. They later developed their business, including the gorgeous Criterion in Piccadilly, and also a number of outer London Railway contracts, enabling them to create the luncheon basket on the Midland Railway. You might have seen John Betjeman's 1973 film Metroland, which opens in the panelled Chiltern Court restaurant. Spiers and Pond were caterers, and they were flourishing even then. If you want to see an example of the Metropolitan Railway's refreshment bars, then go to Baker Street Station. And by the statue of Sherlock Holmes is the entrance to the Metropolitan, which is now a Wetherspoons pub, somewhere that I frequented quite a lot in my guiding student days. In the 1870s, the new development of refrigeration allowed meat from the New World, Australia and New Zealand to be brought to the British market. The meat was placed in hampers and canvas before being placed under tarpaulin in open wagons and transported. London road networks were struggling under the increased pressure, By the mid-1860s, a 4-acre underground meat depot was built underneath the new Smithfield Market in the City of London. Hydraulic lifts were used to move the cargo from the depot to the market buildings above. What's this got to do with the London Underground, I hear you ask? Good question. Well, the depot was served via the Metropolitan Railway, and the entry to the depot can still be spotted on the south side of the line between Farringdon and Moorgate Station. The technology for the safe tunnelling of tubes deeper below London had been developed by the 1870s, but the first successful tube railway was not practical until electric power and safe lifts were perfected in the late 1880s. There was interest in this novel mode of transport, but investors were still cautious. The next tubes didn't open for nearly 10 years, and later schemes also struggled to raise money, but were helped by the intervention of an American financier. These new linked lines opened in 1906 and 7, completing the core of the modern tube system. In 1908, the separate companies started to work together to promote the system as a coherent network under the Underground brand. Gradually, most of the companies merged and the network expanded as the population of London soared. Farringdon Station has changed beyond all recognition. Today, it's a bustling transport hub carrying millions of passengers every year. And now that the new Crossrail link has opened, it's set to become one of the busiest stations in the country. We have several walks in the Farringdon Smithfield area, including Heretics and Horrors of the City, and its part 2 aptly named Bleeding Hearts and Body Parts. And if you want to get to know a little bit more about the railways of London, then join Ian on his King's Cross walk. If you enjoyed this episode, then you might enjoy episode 31, Abandoned London Underground Stations, where I discuss the underground secrets with the lovely Siddy Holloway. And of course, there is also episode 68, London's First Railway. If you like what we do, then please rate and review. It's really great to get your feedback. That's all for now. Until next time.